Hey. Nice. Okay. Yeah. So a little bit about today. Oh, I should keep near the mic. A little bit about today. So again, what we're gonna do for the next 3 weeks, effectively leading us up to the midterm, is going to be working on our second formal language. So really, today and next week are just going to be getting used to doing some symbolizing into it, getting used to the jump from TFL to this new one, first order logic. Then in 3 lectures time, so lecture 6, we'll talk about how to interpret FOL sentences. Now, one of the things we're going to lose with this move to FOL is we won't be able to use tables. And that's because we're moving away from atomic sentences. But we're going to come up with other machinery that will let us do something very similar that we were doing with tables. So the plan for today is, what I'm really going to do is spend quite a bit of time talking to you about the very basic building blocks of this language, the fundamental parts and how they fit together. Because frankly, the rest of it isn't going to make any sense unless we have a grip on the fundamental parts. So we'll spend most of our time on this first bit. Then once we have a kind of grip on how the parts fit together, we'll talk about some basic symbolizations. In particular, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 4 symbolizations that if you know how to do them, you will be able to do about 90% of the exercises for FOL. So I'll just hit you with those. We'll talk then about some other paraphrases and quantifier scope. And then if we have time at the end, I want to talk to you about multiple quantifiers and relations. So if we don't get to this stuff at the end, that's okay. We can talk about it next time. But the big plan is to get through what's up here as 1 and 2. I guess the other thing to ask before we get going, how many people actually did the reading for this week? That's pretty good. Again, so that's fine. I would really, really genuinely, strongly suggest, again, if you're going to do any of the reading, do the readings on this FOL stuff. I'm going to do my best to make it clear, but you got to meet me halfway here. This can be really confusing. Trust me when I say this is the first point when we're going to lose some people. We'll do our best, but that's just the way it always goes. Okay, so let's talk about FOL. Let's talk about the building blocks. The first thing to kind of motivate the shift is to think about an argument we're familiar with, right? So we've seen something very much like this argument before, but I'll throw this one at you. Socrates is human, all humans are mortal, so Socrates is mortal. This is pretty clearly a valid argument, right? It has the same structure as the one we did where all men are carrots. Right? So we know this is valid. But if we think about how we would symbolize this in TFL, we have a problem. Because when we symbolize this in TFL, you might do it something like this, we lose the validity. And this is basically just because the reasons this argument actually is valid don't have to do with the overall sentences. It has to do with subsentential parts. Specifically, to go back, it has to do with the fact that we're talking about Socrates. We're saying he's one of these things that are human. Then all of the things that are human are inside the collection of things that are mortal, so he must be in the collection of things that are mortal too. Right? We did this in the tutorials with the Venn diagrams, and we talked about where we put the dot for Socrates. TFL doesn't let us do any of that. We don't have dots, we can't talk about individuals, we can't really do the Venn diagram stuff. So what we want to do is move to a language that lets us track that. And here's how we'll symbolize the sentences in FOL. So don't worry, we're going to talk about how all the parts fit. But here's the things to note. Instead of atomic sentences, our new base unit is going to be a predicate with a term. So again, I'll say that because it's important. Our new base unit isn't going to be an atomic sentence anymore. It's going to be a predicate plus a term. Now there's two types of terms, and we're going to talk about that more in a second, right? But if you look at our top one, you can already see it. What we have here is the predicate is human, attached with the name Socrates. So the kind of funny, jokey way to put it is FOL splits the atom. That is, it has subsentential parts, right? Instead of just stopping at the level of atomic sentences, we have parts of sentences, names, and ways that those names are. The other neat thing that we have is we have variables. These are the other kinds of term. Variables work just like they did in algebra, right? They're variables. That is, we can replace them. And in fact, they don't really stand for anything. They're just ways for us to label gaps. Again, more on this in a second. But I just want to kind of throw you an example so you can see what an argument symbolized into FOL looks like. So that's what we're going to work on. We're going to work on the grammar for FOL today, do some practice symbolizing, basically get to where we can do stuff like this. And once we symbolize it like this, we can see that the argument is in fact valid. So we're gaining expressive power, but the cost for expressive power is more complexity at the level of grammar. So let's talk about the grammar. Here's the basics of FOL. There's 6 kinds of symbols. There are terms, of which there are 2 types. Names, which we're going to express with lowercase letters A through R. We can use subscripts if we want. Variables, which we'll express with lowercase letters S through Z, which we can use subscripts if we want. Now, they're terms in the sense that they effectively stand in for individual objects. Names basically just take us directly to objects. Variables, again, are kind of like pronouns. That is, we'll be able to replace them with individual objects. More on those in a second. Along with the terms, we have predicates. Predicates will express with capital letters. Now, notably, you will never, ever, 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 ever have a predicate by itself. If you have a capital letter by itself in FOL, you done fucked up. Right? Every predicate must always be attached to at least one term, because that's our base unit now. So it's either going to be attached to a name or attached to a variable. Along with the predicates, we have the connectives. These are just like they were in TFL. They work the exact same. They are truth functional. So everything we learned about the connectives in TFL, cool. Same stuff applies here. Same thing with brackets. They work just like they did. We'll use them if we need them. But just like before, we can set them aside if they're unnecessary. The last part is really where the money for this is. And quantifiers are where it's at. And this is really one of the reasons why FOL is so expressively powerful. We have the backwards E, which is our existential quantifier. It's the way for us to say some. And we have the upside down A, which is our universal quantifier. It's the way for us to say all or every. We're going to go through these one at a time, but I want to go ahead and just show you the whole collection. And we'll talk about how they fit together. Yeah. So the nice thing is some also means it exists, right? Because if there's some, then there's got to be at least one. Somebody's in the room. Cool. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. Yeah, it's the same. Good. Okay, so we'll talk about each one of these in turn, but again, I want to just show them all to you so you at least get the whole collection right off the bat. Let's talk about them one at a time. Names. Well, actually, to get a run up to names, let's think about something in English. In English, there's two types of terms. There's what we might think of as singular terms, which are purported to pick out a single object, and there are what we might think of as general terms, and these pick out something like kinds or types. For example, you might compare Mira, which is a singular term, it picks out my dog, and dog, which picks out the type or kind that Mira is an instance of. Socrates and human, Nathan and philosopher. Again, the difference here is that the singular terms always try and get you to one object. The general term, well, it's not really about a name, it's getting you to something like a kind. And if we think about singular terms, the ones that are purporting to pick out a single object, there are at least two types. There's probably more, but there's at least two. One of them are what we'll call proper names. And these are just, well, tags for specific entities. Nathan, Mira, Socrates. Right? Contrast those with definite descriptions. Definite descriptions purport to pick out one and only one object, but they do it by a description that only that object satisfies. The present King of England. Notice that would have been a very different thing about 2 weeks ago. Right? Or the person teaching this class. Right? As it happens, there's one object that satisfies that description, but it's not really the same as the proper name. It tells us something substantive about the object in order to get us to it. But it serves broadly the same kind of function, right? It picks out just one object. So one does it as a tag, one does it via a special description. We're going to talk eventually about both. But when we think of names in FOL, they work like proper names. That is, they're just tags. They don't convey any substantive information about the things they're names for. So, as I said before, in FOL, names are expressed by lowercase letters a through r. We can use subscripts if we want. That gives us an infinite number of names. And these function very much like proper names in English, with a few caveats. First, there's never any ambiguity. Each name picks out exactly one thing. So what this means is we don't have a problem with like Tim, right? I know at least like 8 guys named Tim. So if I use the name Tim and I say, oh, Tim's coming to the bar, it's like, cool, which one do you mean? Right? We'll never have that issue in FOL. A name always takes us to one object. Right? However, that doesn't mean we can't have multiple names for a single object. Right? So I could call him Tim, I could call him Timmy, I can call him T-Buck, whatever I want, right? Lots of different ways to get to the same thing. Same thing in FOL. I can have lots of different names for a single object. The other big caveat, though, is that names never fail. That is, if we have a name, it's guaranteed to get us to an object. There are no empty names. So the contrast class here is something like Santa. Again, I don't want to destroy people's dreams, but Santa doesn't exist. Oh. Son of a bitch, who was giving me the presents? So Santa is an empty name. It purports to refer to an individual, but it fails. There's no individual that it tags. English has lots of empty names. Not tons, but a good number. FOL has none. Every name is guaranteed to pick something out. We might not necessarily know what it's picking out, but it always succeeds. No empty names. Yeah.
So on a mathematical point of view, it's like saying the function name is
Yes. It's always going to map us to some member here. It never fails. Okay. So when we write a symbolization key for FOL, you saw one a few minutes ago, but I'll say it out loud, right? When we write a symbolization key for FOL, it will tell us, if we're dealing with names, what objects are associated with the relevant names. So for example, I might have A linked up with Socrates, M linked up with Mira, little n linked up with Nathan, etc., etc. Note if the sentences we're dealing with don't have any names involved, then we can get by without actually specifying, because there just aren't any with the sentences we're paying attention to. So names take us to objects. What about variables? We can ignore this, but we'll talk about it for a second. We'll talk about it in a second. Variables will express with lowercase s through z, and we can use subscripts. Now I have a recommendation, and that is avoid using v as a variable. And the recommendation is avoid using v as a variable because you might confuse yourself as to whether you meant disjunction or just v. This is a holdover from when we were doing it online, but it's still something I would suggest avoiding. You don't have to not use it, but it's a very heavy-handed suggestion. It's just better. It'll make it easier for all of us. There's plenty of other letters. So what do variables do? Well, they're really labels for gaps. They function a little bit like pronouns. That is, they don't actually refer. Instead, they give us ways or indicate ways for us to replace them with names, or even better, with objects. So we have something like this. We might want to say X loves Y, but Y doesn't love X. So we have the variables X, and we have the variables Y, and we have them because we're saying, hey, you should plug the same object for here, and potentially a different object here and here, but they need to be the same for both instances. So notably, when constructing an FOL symbolization key, you don't need to tell me what the variables mean, because they don't mean nothing. Right? They're always going to be associated with something. We'll talk about that in a second. Before we go on, I want to pause, because this is real important. It always comes up. Do we get the idea about how the variables work? Right? Again, if we've done stuff like algebra before, or certainly calculus, we've got familiarity with that. They're the exact same. Just instead of numbers or anything, what we're going to plug in is objects. Yeah? Cool? Okay. We'll talk more about it as we go, but again, it's helpful just to get. So those are our terms. They're either going to be names or variables. Every atom, or what would be our atom, is going to have at least one of these. The other thing that every replacement for atoms is going to have is a predicate. Predicates in natural language are ways to express something like properties. So we might have is in the logic class, or a dog slobbered on, or is very tired. Right? Notably, predicates by themselves don't give us complete sentences. They're kind of a Bon Jovi thing. They get us halfway there. Right? What we need is terms to go with them. That's certainly not the first time I've made that joke. That's definitely not the last time I'll make that joke. Right. So, but importantly, right, if we want a full sentence, what we have to have is we need to have a term and a predicate, right? So we take Socrates and the predicate is human, we stick them together and we get a full sentence. Socrates is human. Or we might take Mira and woke up at 3:30 and stick them together to get Mira woke up at 3:30. So when we construct our symbolization keys, we express predicates with capital letters. We can use subscripts if we need them. Right? And what we can do is we'll write the relevant letter and then in English, predicate that it expresses. So for example, right, we'll put H, and then we leave the gap that's going to be filled by the objects. Right? So this says H. H is a way to say is human. Right? And T is a way to say woke up at 3:30 a.m. And T subscript 1 is the Terminator. Right? And we might have like, I don't know, let's have S for a dog slobbered on. Right? Now again, note, what we want to do when we write our predicates is indicate where the gaps are. Because that's telling us where the object's going to be plugged in. Right? So how are we feeling about names, variables, predicates? Good so far? Cool. So we can get a feeling for how the sentences are going to go by basically thinking about our replacement. Like I said, our replacement for atoms are always going to be a predicate and at least one term. If it's a name, we're good. We've got a full sentence already. Because basically we've got an object and we're saying the object satisfies the predicate. If we have a variable, well, we're almost to a full sentence. We need to say some more. And we need to say some more about how we can replace the variable. So we could say something like TM, Mira woke up at 3:30. A note, I can also intermix this with my other connectives, just like we did with TFL. So I can say something like, Mira and Nathan woke up at 3:30 as TM and TN. Mira woke up at 3:30 and Nathan woke up at 3:30. That's one of the reasons why I'm so tired. Right? So we can intermix these things, basically using them, treating them effectively as something like the atoms we had before to play around with our connectives. So let's do a little practice. Here's a simple symbolization key. Right? It's the same one we just saw, and it's the same ones from all of the exercises, and some very simple warm-up, right? So how would we do Mira woke up at 3:30 a.m. using this symbolization key? Yeah, TM, right? And again, note, this is the simplest kind of sentence we'll be able to capture with FOL. This is our most basic sentence. How about Socrates is a Terminator? T1A. Right? Nathan and Socrates are human. HA, conjunction, HN. Note, we can flip them. Just like before, it doesn't matter the order. Right? And our last one, if Mira woke up at 3:30, then Nathan woke up at 3:30. Yeah. TM, conditional, TN. Nice. Okay. So again, some easy kind of warm-ups, but just to start to get a feel for how we're going to do it. Note, these look a whole lot like what we had before, but just instead of simple atoms, they have parts. And the parts are always going to be a predicate and a term. As it happens, every one we've got here has been a name. That's because if it's going to be a variable, we've got to have one more part. And that's going to be the quantifiers. So let's talk about quantifiers. Oh, wow. I like how I totally misspelled the word domains. So let's just pretend that that's spelled right. Domains. That's a fruit, isn't it? No. So here's our first quantifier, the upside down A. The upside down A is our universal quantifier. Note that whenever you have a quantifier, it will always appear next to a variable. I'll say that again. Whenever you have a quantifier, it will always appear next to a variable. That variable is attached to the quantifier. It's bound to it. What we really mean by that is that the quantifier is telling us how we can replace that variable. For the upside down A, it's telling us you can replace this variable with everything. Right? It doesn't matter what you pick. You can replace the relevant variable with that thing and you're good. Right? So this tells us, hey, everything's an H. And this tells us everything's a T. And this tells us everything's an F. Whatever H and T and F mean, we don't really care. At least not yet. So what's the function of the universal quantifier? Again, it's that we can replace the associated variable with every name, with every object, and get out a true sentence. So effectively, the universal is a bit like a giant conjunction. If we have for all x, each x, it's a bit like saying A's an H, and B's an H, and C's an H, and D's an H, and so on for every single object. And note, it's a conjunction because it's got to be for all. Everybody gets in. And if nobody doesn't, if even one thing isn't an H, then the universal's false. If there's even one thing that's not an H, then the universal's false. We'll talk more about when these are true and false as we go along, but it's helpful maybe to see that. And note, the quantifiers can be in front of complex sentences too. So what we have here is, hey, everything can be plugged in for Y, and it will make the embedded conditional true. Again, that's just basically another way to say this big long conjunction's true. A makes the conditional true, and B makes the conditional true, and C, and D, and E, and F, and da 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 da. Okay, so there's the universal. The other one that we have is the existential. This is the backwards E. And it says for some, or maybe also at least one. Just like the universal, it will always appear next to a variable. That variable is bound by the relevant quantifier, bound by the existential. So this tells us there's something that's an H, there's something that's an F, there's something that's a T. The function here is to say, hey, there's some object that we can replace the relevant variable with that will make this sentence true. There might be lots, but all it really says is there's at least one. So it's more like, instead of a conjunction, it's like a disjunction. It says, right, if we use the existential HX, it's saying, hey, either A's an H, or B's an H, or C's an H, or I don't know, maybe G's an H, right? All we need is one. And just like the universal, we can also use it in complex sentences, and it performs the same function, whether it's a simple one or whether it's a complex one. So, again, the difference between the quantifiers. The upside down A is everybody. Everybody's satisfying it. You can replace the variable with every single object. The E just only needs one. It's just some. So here's the trick. I told you our base unit is going to be a variable and a term. If the term is a name, we're done. So if it's H and A, cool, we've got a sentence. If it's a variable, if it's H and X, say, there's always going to have to be a quantifier. We need to put it something like this. And that's because only once we have the quantifier do we know how we're supposed to replace the variable. Without a quantifier, it's basically just not a sentence. We don't know how we're supposed to read the relevant pronoun, if you like. Again, we'll talk more about this as we go along, but I want to go ahead and throw it to you right now. Hear it the first time. That's it. That's basically the grammar. Those are all the parts. We're going to talk about exactly how they fit together, but once we got them, we're good. So how are we feeling about universal and existential? Yeah, got at least the basic idea? So let's do some practice. So here's our same sample symbolization key. Notice the exact same one as we had before. Right? How would we do everyone is human? We got to be careful, right? Yeah, we always, if we write the universal, it's got to be attached to a variable. So we'd have the universal quantifier and then some variable. And then we want to attach that same variable to the predicate H. So we get something like this, right? This tells us, hey, you can pick everything in the domain and replace the X with it, and you're going to get something true. Everything's an H, which of course means everything is human. Now again, note the structure. If you have a quantifier, it must be attached to a variable, and then we'll use that variable again later in the sentence. All right. How about somebody's human? Yeah. It'll be our existential, right? Okay. Not too bad. How about there's a human and Mira woke up at 3:30? Yeah, there we go. Right? Our existential, again, attached to a variable. It tells us, hey, there's something that's a human. That's a typo. My bad. That should be an M. Somebody, oh shit, where's Jay coming from? That's just me being dumb. Sorry, guys. This is what happens when you edit your slides at 4 in the morning. And how about our last one? If Socrates is the Terminator, then everyone is. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. What's the consequence? Yeah, nice. Right? So, if Socrates is a Terminator, right? If A is a T1, then for all x, T1x, everything can be plugged in as a Terminator. Okay. Before we go on, again, do we kind of see the building rules? What questions do you have for me on the building rules so far? Again, we haven't really talked about them officially, but we kind of gestured at them so far. We good? No. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily say that there doesn't exist a Terminator, right? It just tells us that, hey, if Socrates is, then everybody is. So that's perfectly compatible with there being some Terminators out there. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I understand it's a variable.
Yes.
Meaning it does not have to be defined. But like the previous example, you had the H X in the parentheses. In this one, you don't.
Yeah. Good. Good. So, good question here. The question was, right, let's look at if we look at the one we've got on top here, right, if we look at our top two answers, I don't have brackets, right? I just have the universal or the existential of the variable and then attached to a predicate. The short answer, right, is you can have the brackets there or you can leave them off. It's fine. In some sense, it's very much like when we have just a negation. I can stick the negation in front, or I could stick the negation in front of the brackets if I find that easier. We can use the brackets if you find it helpful. You can leave them off if you don't. But there'll be a contrast. To go back, we needed the brackets here. And we need the brackets here in this very bottom sentence because it's telling us there's something that makes this whole conditional true. It's saying the quantifier is the main operator here. It's controlling the conditional. Contrast that with our last one. Our last sentence, the main operator is the conditional. So that's one of the ways we'll draw it out. Okay, cool. So one more. Using the same symbolization key, how would we do if someone's a terminator, then everyone is? Yeah, so here we hit a trick, right? Yeah. So note, here's a problem with this one. It looks like what we need is we need a quantifier in the front and another quantifier in the back, right? We got to say, if there is a terminator with the existential, then the back's got to say, everybody's a terminator. Here's something nice. That's no problem. Why? Why is this no problem? Close. So here's the trick with this one, right? Let's look at the scope of the quantifiers. If we look at the scope of the quantifiers, they have different scope. Hey. If we look at our first quantifier, its scope is just the antecedent. Right? That is, it's only attached to the first part of the conditional. Then if we look at the second quantifier, it's only attached to the second part of the conditional. They don't overlap each other. And that's fine. One of the things that we don't want to do is have quantifiers overlap each other with the same variable. Here's a bad one. We can't do this. And we can't do this because if we look, say, at that very first x, we don't know who it's attached to. Is it attached to the universal or is it attached to the existential? It looks like it's both. Yeah. Good. But see, this one is inside the brackets and inside the scope of that one. So it's got both of them attached to it. That's bad. Yeah. Yes. So the one above, what's the difference? The one above, there is no scope confusion here. There's no what we'll call clash of variables. Because when we look at each x, each variable, we know who it's attached to. This one's on the existential, this one's on the universal. Come down to this sentence. I don't know who that's attached to. I can't figure out how to replace the first x.
But if there were the different product examples, would there be a different scope or like
Yeah.
the meanings would be different?
Yes. So, importantly, right, in our top one, we've got clear scopes. Our bottom one, we have bad scopes. How do we avoid it? There's an easy solution. Use different variables. The problem here isn't having quantifiers that overlap. It's having quantifiers that overlap that are using the exact same variable. Yeah.
But like, how would the first sentence on top change meaning if we took out the clause of the universal quantifier?
So if we took out the clause, just took out this quantifier, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, for one thing, it would be ungrammatical. If there wasn't a quantifier in the back half, and I just had tx, I wouldn't know how to fill in the t there. The variable isn't attached. Whenever we have a variable, it's always going to be attached to a quantifier. Importantly, it's also only ever attached to one quantifier. That's why this is a no-no, and that's why if we didn't have that, it would be a no-no too.
And if we put like p1x into brackets.
Yeah, so if you put brackets there and there without this,
Yeah.
that would be okay.
But like, how would the sentence
That would be basically, there's something such that if it's a terminator, then it's a terminator. Which is not a terribly exciting sentence. But we can express it. Yes?
Can you tell the difference between the first one and the second one with the Y?
Yes. So these two are equivalent. This one and this one, they're perfectly identical.
Then why would we do the second one if the first one is the right?
Sometimes it'll be very helpful to have that quantifier in the front. Because then what you want to do is figure out what happens with this quantifier. It's a little bit harder to play around with the conditionals. That's the real reason. Sometimes it'll be nice to switch forms. A cheap answer is they're a bit like transformers. Sometimes we want them in one form because that's better for the battle we want to have. Okay, so here's the next bit that we have to have. Hey guys, don't talk. Otherwise, I'll just fucking end it and we'll go home real early. Yeah, I mean, that's cool with me. So, with regards to the domains, this is the other thing that's really important when we're constructing our FOL symbolization keys. And the way to think about it is this. I sit around with my buddy Alfred a lot, drinking far too much beer. And we find ourselves in this situation where one of us will go to the fridge and say, oh shit, all the beer is gone. But of course what we're saying there isn't, there's no beer in the world, otherwise we would be much, much more upset. Right? It's just that we can't get a hold of any more beer. There's no beer in the fridge. So what's the idea? The idea is that when we think about this kind of claim, in English, we often allow context to specify the relevant restrictions. Context is what makes it clear that I was talking about there's no beer in the fridge. Right? So that's cool for English, but we can't do that with FOL. FOL doesn't have anything like context. We can't implicitly allow for the relevant restricted groupings. Instead, we do it explicitly. We do that by specifying a domain. And again, I'm very happy that I think I spelled domain right this time. So what's a domain? Well, a domain is the collection of things we're talking about. Right? When we build an FOL symbolization key, we will always specify a domain. Ooh, you okay? Right? When we build a symbolization key, we always specify a domain, the things we're talking about. It can be pretty small. It can be the stuff in the fridge. It can be all the physical objects. It can be everything ever that's ever existed. If nothing's specified, then you should just assume the domain is universal. It can be as small as one single object. So the domain might just be the clicker. Now the domain's useful because, again, it tells us these are the things we're talking about. More importantly, the domain is what the quantifiers range over. That is, the quantifiers are a bit like the cranes in the crane game. The existential tells us, right, if you play the game right, you'll be able to find the one thing, or at least one thing, that makes your sentence true. The universal says, screw it, just push the button to launch the crane. No matter what you grab, it's going to be good. So what we get really is when we have things like a universal, it's telling us for all the things in your domain. So for all things in the fridge, they're not beer, say. Or alternatively, our existential is telling us there's at least one thing in the domain, i.e. in the fridge, that is, I don't know, an old ham sandwich, say. Domains are important because they, again, tell us what the hell it is we're talking about. They're the things the quantifiers will kind of swoop over, range over. Okay, nice. So when we build an FOL symbolization key, it's always going to have three parts. It's going to specify a domain, it's going to tell us the relevant predicates. And if we have any names present, it's going to tell us which objects in the domain the names pick out. Now we have a few simplifying things built into our system. And here are really the two. We've mentioned one already. But the first one is we never have an empty domain. There's always at least one thing in the domain. Domains must always include at least one thing. That's the kind of bare minimum. That's the floor. Right? Relatedly, each name picks out exactly one thing. There are no empty names. Right? Together, these ensure we can always infer an existential from any named sentence. So if we know Tn, even if we don't know who n is or what n is, we know there's going to be something in the domain that's a T. This is a very handy inference. So, the big lesson, the take-home thing, a domain must have at least one member, and a name must pick out exactly one member of the domain. But a member of the domain may be picked out by many, one, or even no names. So for example, if our domain was all people ever, that goes both into the past, includes the present, and includes all future people, many of whom we don't have names for. But we can still talk about them. They're all mortal. So there'll be lots of things in our domain then that do not have names, but we can still quantify over them, use them in our formalism. Awesome. Okay. So let's talk about FOL symbolizing. That's all the stuff we need. Let's talk about some basics for translating English, sorry, I shouldn't say translating, symbolizing English into FOL. The whole of our logic is going to be the names, predicates, quantifiers, connectives. And symbolizing is just going to be simply putting these things into the right kind of order to get out the thing we want. And the way we're going to do it, the most helpful thing I can suggest, is again, to paraphrase English. To find ways to figure out how to take the English, keep the same meaning, and turn it into something you know how to directly map. Sometimes that'll be really easy. Sometimes it'll take a little bit of work. And what I want to highlight is, let's say, 6 things about paraphrase. Okay. The first one has to do with when we might use conjunction. So, here's Steve. Steve is a fat American. I love this picture. So here's our sample symbolization key. We have F for his fat, A for his American, and little s for Steve. How would we symbolize Steve as a fat American? How would we express this in FOL? Yeah. We want FS conjunction AS. Because what's our English sentence say? Well, we can paraphrase it in English to say Steve is fat and Steve is American. So we know how to get this one. Okay. Now let's contrast the fat American Steve with Zlatan. He is genuinely one of my favorite people ever. Are people familiar with Zlatan? Good, good, yes, amazing. So let's think about how we would symbolize some sentences about Zlatan. So some things to know about him. He is an amazing footballer. He is a shitty person. He is not a very good person. That's okay though. He's a really good footballer. So let's think about how we would symbolize 1, 2, and 3 using this key. How would we do 1? Zlatan's a good footballer. Yeah, right? Using this key, it looks like it'd be GA conjunction FA. And note, of course, Zlatan is A because he comes first. He's number 1. Okay, cool. Now how about our second one? Zlatan is a person. PA, right? Easy peasy. And how about our last one? Zlatan's a good person. PA conjunction GA. That's kind of bad though, because this looks like the fact that Zlatan's a person and a good footballer means that he's actually a good person. Right? Because this says he's good and a footballer and he's a person. And obviously if those two are true, well then GA is true. So it must then be that he's a good person. Wait, no, that's not right. Something went wrong here. I told you, he's a really good footballer. He's a bad person. So what went wrong is we were kind of misled by our symbolizing. In fact, I cheated you a little bit with the symbolization key. The problem here is that it's a mistake to treat good footballer as fat American. Right? Or to put another way, if we look at it here, the good isn't modifying the subject, it's modifying the other adjective. He's a good footballer. Similarly, in this one, he's a good person. So it's a mistake here to treat these as distinct predicates. The real move would be to do this. We need a symbolization key like this, where we have is a person, is a good person, and is a good footballer. And if we have this key, we can get the right things. Because now 1 and 2 do not entail 3. So I use this as an example. I'm not going to give you something like this where I'll intentionally give you the wrong key, but it's a helpful little thing to point out this. If you see 2 adjectives in a row, be careful to assess them whether they're like the first example or whether they're more like Zlatan. Yes?
Is it possible to put two predicates like after each other?
No. So if we have predicates, they're always going to be separate. They're always going to have their own terms. And if they're connected, they're going to be connected via connectives. That's the basic grammar. Right? And the way to tell is you will even see them in the keys. A predicate has a gap. That gap has to be filled to get anything close to a sentence. And it can't be filled by a predicate. So we can't have, is a good footballer as a person. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. So there was our first one. What I want to do next is talk to you about 4 forms. And again, I mentioned these earlier, but if you know these 4 forms, you basically have I'll say probably 80% of the symbolizing into FOL we're going to do. And we're going to come at these 4 forms via these 4 sentences. Every dog in the house is a Jack Russell. Some dog in the house is a Jack Russell. Not all dogs in the house are Jack Russells. And no dogs in the house are Jack Russells. And we'll have our symbolization key down here. Our domain will be dogs. We'll have the H predicate for is in the house. And we'll have the J predicate for is a Jack Russell. Right? Everyone knows what a Jack Russell is, right? It's a breed of dog. They're little, not quite small enough to be yappy, just a nice size. It's a good dog. So let's go through these one by one, right? And again, if we know how to symbolize these kind of sentences, we'll be pretty good for pretty much everything we want to do. Right? So let's take our first one. Every dog in the house is a Jack Russell. How might we symbolize this? It looks like, right, it's definitely going to use our universal, right? Because it's every. But the trick's going to be what goes in the middle. So we know it's going to be the universal, the upside down A. Now what do we think? Yeah?
First, upside down A, H, conjunction, upside down J, upside down A, J.
Like this. That was the suggestion, yeah? Let's think. So I could totally see why this is a natural pull. But let's think. What does this sentence say? So this tells us everything in the domain is in the house and is a Jack Russell. Right? But that's not what the English says. Yeah? Yeah, good. Right? So what we've got written down tells us every dog is both in the house and a Jack Russell. But the English says, hey, every dog that's in the house is a Jack Russell. So if my English bulldog is kicking around outside, that's not going to make this claim false. The claim says, hey, look, if you went and hunted down all the dogs in the house, you're going to see that every one of them is this breed. So it's like this. For all x, hx, conditional jx. Again, why? This tells us, hey, for everything, if it's in the house, it's one of these. Whereas this tells us, hey, everything is both in the house and a Jack Russell. So here's the general lesson. A sentence can be symbolized as for all x, fx conditional gx, if it can be paraphrased in English as every f is g. This is the first one of four. Every f is g. We can get like this. And note, it doesn't matter what the f is, it doesn't matter what the g is. Okay? So here's our first one. Let's think about our second one. Our first one was every dog in the house is a Jack Russell. Second one's some dog in the house is a Jack Russell. How do we think this one's going to go? It's going to use the existential, right? It's going to have the E. Then what? Yeah. It feels like it should be the conditional again, right? But let's think about what the conditional says, right? If we have the existential conditional, it just tells us there's something that makes the conditional true. This says some dog is such that if it's in the house, then it's a Jack Russell. And what's an easy way to make that true? We find a dog that's not in the house. Because any dog that's not in the house will make this true. Because a dog that's not in the house makes the antecedent false. And every conditional with a false antecedent is fucking true. So this isn't quite tracking what we want. We got to use the conjunction. We got to use the conjunction. So here's what we want. Our sentence can be paraphrased in English as, there's some dog that's both in the house and is a Jack Russell. Like this. So it's existential X, HX, conjunction JX. Or, to give you the generalized one, a sentence can be symbolized with the existential conjunction if it can be paraphrased as some F is G. So, if we have every F is G, it's the universal with the conditional. If we have some F is G, it's the existential with the conjunction. In fact, more generally, the vast majority of the time, if you have a universal, it will go with a conditional. Alternatively, if you have an existential, it will go with a conjunction. Universals and conditionals go together. Existentials and conjunctions go together. That's the easy way to try and remember. Okay, so we did every and some. Right? How about our last two? Not all dogs in the house are Jack Russells, and no dogs in the house are Jack Russells. How might we do not all dogs in the house are Jack Russells? Yeah, close, right? But we want to tweak it a little bit. Right? If it's not all, what is it saying? Yeah, nice. So if it says not all, it's not the case that every dog in the house is Jack Russell. It's not the case that every dog in the house is Jack Russell. That is, we just literally stick a negation in front of the one we did before, the first one. So this is one way we can capture not all. The other way we can capture not all is we can say, well, look, if not all the dogs in the house are Jack Russells, then there has to be at least one dog in the house that's something else. Maybe there's a corgi. Throwing in something for the queen, right? Right. So we could also get it this way. There is something that's an H, and it's not a J. So we have two different ways to capture that top sentence. You can either do it with the negated universal conditional, or the existential, a conjunction, and then you negate the second conjunct. Yes?
Could it be the case that there is no dog in the house that is a Jack Russell Terrier?
That's going to be our next one.
No, I mean, like,
In this one.
Imply that.
It doesn't imply it, but it's compatible with it, right?
Wouldn't the second one be wrong?
No, because this is just, there's nothing that's both an H and a J, right? And that could be because there's no H's. Yeah. Good. All right. So we've got our top ones. Let's think about our second one. No dogs in the house are Jack Russells. Well, one way to come at this one is as it's not the case that there is some dog that's in the house and is a Jack Russell. Does that look at all familiar? Yeah. It's just the negated existential. Right? It's the negation of the second one we did. Now that's one way to do it. The other way we could do it is if no dogs in the house are Jack Russells, if we find a dog in the house, what would it have to be? Yeah, it's got to be something else, right? So we can get it this way too. Everything that's in the house ain't one of those. Right? Okay. So, when we look at these sentences, we have four ways to do them. The top two for the top, the bottom two for the bottom. Or generalizing, here we go. A sentence can be symbolized either nya or nya. Oh, that's missing a negation. If it can be paraphrased in English as not all F's or G's, sorry, there should be a negation in the front there. Right. And with our bottom one, right, a sentence can be symbolized as this or this if it can be paraphrased as no F's or G's. Genuinely, if we know these four patterns, we are golden. Notably, in the back of the book, I don't know if people have looked in the back of the actual textbook, there are rules just for these four to help you remember these four symbolized formats. That's because we ask about them a lot. I'm definitely going to use them on the midterm. Know how to do them. Forget the fucking thing's recording too. That's great. Well, everybody at home knows too. So those are the four. If we know how to say every F is G, some F's are G's, not all F's are G's, and no F's are G's, we're good. We know how to pretty much do everything we want. Okay. How are we feeling? Terrible. I appreciate the honesty. I shouldn't laugh. But it's the only time I feel alive. Okay. I'm going to throw you a few more things. We won't go much longer because I think that we've hit a lot, right? But I want to mention a few more things before we wrap up. So here are a few more of the things. Again, I understand that this is a lot, and what we're going to do, we're going to spend 3 weeks on this stuff. Going to go slow. We're going to do a hell of a lot of exercises on them in the tutorials. So, some important logical equivalences to note. Our first pair, a really nice thing to know, is that if you have a quantifier, a universal quantifier, followed by a negation, you can push the negation through and it turns the quantifier into an existential. So if you have everything's not an A, well then it's got to be the case that nothing is. Right? If everything is not, then nothing is. And vice versa. So there's our first equivalence. And our second one is very similar. If you have the existential followed by the negation, you can push the negation through and it turns it into the other quantifier. So if there's something that's not, then it's not the case that everything is. Or to put it in a concrete example, if everybody's outside the room, then it's not the case that somebody's in the room. Alternatively, if there's somebody outside, it ain't the case that everybody's inside. Yes? Absolutely. So here's the trick. Everything we're doing here is maths. Or maybe better is, actually the reason why it works in maths is we came up with it first. They stole it from us. But yes. So importantly, again, we have this relationship between the quantifiers and negation. You can push them through, and it changes the negation into the other type. The other equivalents to note, or the other pair of equivalences to note, are basically just the two ones that I gave you a second ago. With not all and none. Again, these ones are handy. They're going to be really handy when we get to natural deduction in the second half. But it's helpful to see them now. Okay. So, we're doing pretty good. Here's what I want to do. I want to talk about two more things. Okay? The first thing is going to be Pokemon. And the second thing is going to be about love. Yeah, it's not going to be that fun. Don't go, ah. So here's the thing about Pokemon. Okay, and this will take us probably about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll get out, okay? Because again, I know I've thrown a hell of a lot of stuff at you. So here's our first thing. And this is about when we're doing symbolizations and some funny things about truth conditions. Right? So I told you that names can pick out exactly one thing in the domain, but I never said anything about predicates. In particular, there's no problem with having predicates pick out nothing. Or maybe better to say, to have predicates that nothing in our domain satisfy. And to put some technical terminology here, we can say a predicate that applies to nothing in the domain is empty. Empty predicates are interesting because they lead to some funny results. So, here's our sample symbolization key. Let's have the domain be people. Let's have the predicate P be is a Pokemon and CB is cute. Using this symbolization key, how would we symbolize 5? All Pokemon are cute. All good except the conjunction. So this is a way to say every F is G. Every Pokemon is cute. So we want the conditional, right? Again, the thing to remember, if you use the universal, it's almost always going to go hand in hand with the conditional. So we want this. Every Pokemon, Everything that's a Pokemon is cute. Yes. Good. You've already seen where I'm getting to. Let's do the symbolizing first. Right? And how about our sixth one? How would we do number 6? Some Pokemon is cute. If we do some, which one are we using? Yeah, it's our existential, right? So we're going to get this. Some Pokemon's cute. Okay? Now, let's think about, actually this comes right back to what you asked me. Given the domain, there's something really funny about this sentence. What's funny about this sentence? Yeah? Well, no. So it's not considering people as Pokemon. Sorry. Right? Here's the funny thing. People ain't Pokemon, right? No persons are a Pokemon. At least plausibly so. What that means is that the antecedent for this conditional is always false. No matter who we pick and plug in, it makes the antecedent there false. So given our setup, what's the truth value for sentence 5? It's got to be true. And it's true because the antecedent is empty. Again, that was a quick trick, but it's important to see it, right? We've set this up so that the antecedent here is guaranteed to be empty. And if we do that, that's guaranteeing that the whole universal conditional is true. 5 is true. But 6 is false. And 6 is false because no matter how hard we look, we can't find something that's both a Pokemon and cute. We might find lots of cute people, but we never find a cute Pokemon because Pokemon aren't people. So, what's the lesson here? Yeah.
The bottom one, does it say some Pokemon are cute or some Pokemon is cute?
Good. So, the nice thing is we can read it as plural or singular. It kind of doesn't matter. And the English, especially American English, lets you do either one. Yes.
Then what would you use in the domain to make it applicable in this case instead of?
Oh, if we had the domain of people and Pokemon, then we'd be good to go, right? But as it happens, because our domain is people and people aren't Pokemon, okay. So here's the neat lesson here. If we have an empty predicate, that is, a predicate that doesn't apply to anything in the domain, then every sentence like this will be vacuously true. And that is, it's true because there's nothing that satisfies the antecedent. Yes. Good. So that means empty. Right? So like a vacuum. The vacuum of space, the emptiness of space. Right? So it's vacuously true because there's just nothing you can fill in to make the first part true. Okay. So that was my bit on Pokemon. The important thing here was, again, this point about vacuous truth with empty predicates. I'm going to skip over Marco, which is a shame because he's such a handsome boy. But we'll talk about these maybe in tutorial. I want to talk about love. So our last 5-10 minutes here will be about love. So here's the really, really, really cool thing about FOL. Everything we've done so far is really nice. And it lets us do a whole bunch. But the amazing thing is once we allow for predicates with multiple gaps. So far, every example we've talked about is a predicate with one gap. Is a footballer, is a good footballer, is human, is a Pokemon, etc., etc. But not every predicate's going to be like that. We might have predicates with 2 gaps. loves, where we have the first gap is the lover, and the second gap is the beloved, the target. I know, it sounds a bad way to put it. It makes it sound a little bit. Here's a slightly nicer one, is next to, right? One object can be next to another. Right? And we can have three place predicates, is in between. In theory, there's no upper limit to the number of gaps a predicate might have. But importantly, the gaps are different, right? The gaps are different. The person that we fill in for the lover and the person we fill in for the beloved, well, that kind of matters. And the way we can fill them in is the same as with single place predicates. We can fill them in with names or we can fill them in with variables. So here's a sample symbolization key. Let's have people. Let's have little f for Finn. Let's have little b for Princess Bubblegum. And we'll have loves. Now again, note that loves has two spaces. So what we want to do is we can fill in the space with the person fitting the right gap. So for example, we have Finn loves Princess Bubblegum. We can write this as LFB. L is the two-place predicate, requires two terms after it. What comes immediately after fills space 1, and what comes after that fills space 2. Make sense? So how would we do Finn loves Finn? LFF. How would we do Finn loves Princess Bubblegum, but Bubblegum doesn't love Finn? Yeah. LFB, conjunction, not LBF. No, what this tells us is that, again, which spot we put the particular name lines up with a spot in the predicate. The first one's the lover, the second one is the beloved. Yeah? Do we kind of see that? Again, we'll talk more about this in the tutorials, but I want to hit it with you first. No, you're lost. Okay. So let's think about our last one. Princess Bubblegum's loved by Finn. LFB, right? It's just another way to say the same one at the top. Now, why does this matter? Here's something fun. Right? When dealing with predicates with more than one place, we've got to be careful with the order that we fill them in. Everybody loves somebody. Everybody loves somebody. There's two ways to read this. One way to read this is for each one of us, there'll be someone we love. It might be somebody different. Here's the other way to read it. There's one person that everyone loves. Everybody loves somebody. Right? Now we can, using all of the things that we've got, pull the differences apart. So here's the two readings. For each person, there's some person they love. There's some particular person everyone loves. Here's the really silly thing. The difference here is literally just in the order that we write the quantifiers. We can have this, or we can have this. And these say different things. Now we'll talk more about why they say different things next time. And we'll do some exercises associated with these in the tutorial. But I want to go ahead and tell you about it. Right? So the difference here is, again, the order that we fill in the spots. Right? It seems so close, but the simple fact that we flip the order here gives us different sentences and different cases. So one of the neat things about FOL is that we can actually track that difference. That's why this thing is so damn powerful. Having multiple place predicates and having multiple quantifiers lets us do a whole bunch of really neat stuff. So that's what we're going to try and do building from here. So, what we're going to do next time we're going to talk more about FOL. We're going to keep building on what we're doing. In particular, I'm going to talk about the last little parts of the whole setup. Really, all we're missing is one more thing. There's one more special predicate, which is identity. Once we have it, the full battle station is operational. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Take care, guys, and I'll see hopefully you all tomorrow in the tutorials.